Hello, and welcome to The Psychonaut Show. I'm Dr. John Burton. As a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist, I'm an explorer of the psyche, a psychonaut.
And I'm Dr. Tracy Seidsinger, a psychoanalytic psychologist, writer, mother, and fellow psychonaut.
And we're your hosts on this podcast that explores the rich history and insights of psychoanalysis, the powerful experiences of psychedelics, and where they come together to deepen understanding and relationship to our inner worlds.
Each episode, we will talk with an experienced pioneer who's working in this intersecting space. We'll journey together through questions, research, treatment, and mystery. Welcome along, dear psychonauts. Hi, Dr. John.
Hello, Dr. Tracy.
Today, we're excited to have with us Dr. Harold Kudler, a psychoanalyst who has held multiple leadership roles, often addressing psychedelics, veterans' mental health, or both, across his distinguished career. He received his MD from Downstate Medical Center, trained in psychiatry at Yale, and is medical associate professor at Duke and adjunct professor at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. From 2000 through 2005, he co-chaired the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Special Committee on PTSD, which reports directly to Congress. Dr. Harold has served on the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies Board of Directors, co-led development of joint VA Department of Defense guidelines for the management of post-traumatic stress, and advised Sesame Street's Talk, Listen, Connect series for military families. He's a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and serves as part of the association's psilocybin psychedelics workgroup. This is an incomplete but remarkable list. I want to thank you for all the work you've done, and also the veterans who have given more than perhaps any other group to our understanding of psychedelic treatment. Dr. Harold, welcome to the Psychonaut Show.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Harold, and for your work, and echoing Tracy for the veterans that you've worked with and what they've taught us, much with your help. As with all of our guests, we start with the question, what is your journey?
Yes, well, I was born in the early 1950s, and so had a chance to live through the 60s. Even went to Woodstock. That part of my career, I was working in a Boy Scout camp at the time, so the one thing that really meant is I was one of the few people at Woodstock who had actually thought to bring a raincoat and ground cloth too. So, but I still got soaking wet. That's the way it is. But I myself avoided drugs in the 60s and 70s. While a lot of people around me were using them, I didn't judge them. It just never felt right for me. But I was always fascinated with altered states of consciousness. One thing that comes to mind about that, I was, I believe, 14 or 15 when I first saw the movie Freud, The Secret Passion. And in the movie, John Huston, who directed it, and based it on, in many ways, on his own experience treating veterans of World War II in an Army hospital back when he was working for the Army during the war. He made a training film for psychiatrists about dealing with various kinds of post-combat psychological problems, conversion, dissociation. Not exactly what we call PTSD, but PTSD symptoms. Anyway, I'm watching that on television with my family at age 14, and they recreated a scene from Charcot back in the probably about 1885, 86, using hypnosis to treat people with hysteria. And they showed him actually hypnotizing the patient and under hypnosis, taking the patient's symptoms away entirely. And then to make it even more interesting, he had two patients who were hypnotized, and he put the symptoms of one person into the other person. Now, this is a movie, but it is an actual accurate representation of the demonstrations that Charcot did, demonstrations which I learned later Freud had actually sat in and watched, and which influenced him a great deal. And I'm pretty sure in my 14, 15-year-old mind, I made up my mind then, wouldn't it be great to do stuff like that? I have to say, in my somewhat older mind now, and for a lot of years as a psychiatrist, I realized that I needed to be very careful not to put my wish to do magic into action. And I think that's a thought I come back to a great deal because I think, like most doctors, I would really like to be able to help people through some special power, some special gift, some technique I learned. I've learned too many stories. There's a danger in going places when you don't really understand where you're going. I've learned studying the history of psychiatry, whether we go back to Mesmer, who believed he was an animal magnet and could magnetize people, and by magnetizing them, solve problems in their lives, create altered states, what he called magnetic crises, and help a lot of people. He helped a lot of people. But ultimately, his belief in himself and his belief in the phenomenon which he believed he was entirely responsible for creating led to his being discredited. And the important work he was doing, whatever it was, he was helping people with serious medical problems that no one else could help with. But that entire body of work was discredited for 100 years. It goes with my natural inclination to be fascinated, to be interested, to be motivated to learn as much as I can, and to do what I can with what I've learned, but not to be pulled into phenomena that I don't really understand.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially this fascination with altered states, but the caution. I mean, I think there's this duality that many of us often feel between science and mystery or science and magic. If I can read something that you've written before, that might help us talk a little bit more about this question of the duality and how to navigate it. In an article for the American Psychoanalyst called Trance and Trauma, you quoted the World War I psychiatrist W.H.R. Rivers, who said, "One of the most striking results of the modern developments of our knowledge concerning the influence of mental factors in disease is that they are bringing back medicine in some measure to that cooperation with religion, which existed in the early stages of human progress." Can you tell us what he meant by the cooperation of religion? And might that be relevant in how we're thinking about the role of psychedelics now?
I'm so glad you read that quote, and it's a great question. Rivers is really one of my heroes in psychiatry. And here's a guy who opens up the first scientific laboratory in psychology at Cambridge University. I think he was like 24 years old.
Wow.
He was a bright guy.
Mhm.
Wow.
And he was very interested in creating a science of psychology in which observable behaviors could be measured. But a few years into that, he's invited by a different Cambridge team to go with them on an anthropologic expedition to the Torres Straits Islands, which are a group of islands off the coast of Australia, including New Guinea, and where there are several communities of indigenous people. And Rivers is there at first. He wants to study the way that they visualize things and measure their perceptions in various ways. But he gets pulled into thinking like an anthropologist. How are these people working together? And particularly, he follows shamans. How do they heal? And they do seem capable of healing in many cases. And what makes that possible? Years later, in World War I, he becomes an army psychiatrist. In his own way, I think adapts that anthropologic view, whereas his colleagues are trying medicines and powerful, painful electric shocks. And this history is beautifully written in an historical novel based on Rivers' own papers, the diaries of his patients, other scientific papers of the time, Regeneration, a trilogy of novels. What it shows Rivers doing is listening to people instead of trying to do things to them to take away their symptoms, treating them as human beings, encouraging them to help each other. What's fascinating is some of his patients are among the most famous war poets of World War I, including Siegfried Sassoon. The very last page of the three-novel trilogy, the author, Pat Barker, has a very interesting scene where Rivers is on the ward and he's been up late. He's falling asleep at the nursing station, and he has a kind of a hypnopompic hallucination as he's falling asleep, the kind of thing that sometimes happens to people when they're falling asleep. He sees the shaman coming on the ward, and walking down the hallway past the patients and the nurses. And the shaman is simply chanting something along the lines of, we have to accept loss. We have to accept the death of kings, the death of friends. We have to live forward, letting these things go. And I think Pat Barker, who has a wonderful sense for rivers and leaves him in a kind of an altered state at the end of all this, is saying that it was Rivers' ability to stay in the moment, alert, present, clear-minded in his own way, and at the same time reach out for what was the essential human response to overwhelming trauma, to join in conversation and develop a very special kind of relationship without throwing in hypnosis, without throwing in drugs, without throwing in electricity. A human relationship with his people that operated on a very deep level of respect and understanding, a little bit like Keats' idea of negative capability, not asking why is this happening or what does this mean or how will I write an article about this, but just being there with people and sharing a mind with them. I think psychoanalysis does that.
And can you just define for our listeners who might not be as familiar with psychoanalytic terms the negative capability?
Well, it's actually a poetic term that which Keats writes about in a letter. Keats says that the ideal for a human would be to be able to stand in the midst of all the mysteries of the universe and not feel to ask why, to kind of be there without being perturbed, without struggling with it, without needing to understand it all, but just to be in the world that way. I've always thought that Keats wasn't talking about taking a drug or getting alcohol or anything else, that this could be done by, I think, tuning your mind into your inner self and into the world around you and communing that way.
To Tracy's question, defining negative capability, it felt to me too like you were speaking to perhaps psychoanalysis, maybe your own values or way of thinking about what psychoanalysis is at its best. Can you tell us about that?
It's a tough question because psychoanalysis is filled with jargon and history and all sorts of things. But at its best, and I'm sort of paraphrasing Harry Stack Sullivan, that psychoanalysis involves two people coming together, one of whom is somebody who's really having trouble they need help with, and the other who's an expert. But how does the expert help? Not by saying things they've learned in a book or things from their own intuition, but by helping the person with a problem, listening very carefully to the person and helping them listen to themselves. And as they listen to themselves, learning to understand their own questions and come up with at least useful answers that gets them through to the next point. Psychoanalysis is all about people who have lost the capacity, and I'm here now quoting Hilda Brooks, that the main problem that brings people into psychotherapy is the sense they've lost agency in their life, that the center of gravity is outside of themselves, and they feel overwhelmed and helpless and threatened by all sorts of things, including their own feelings. They have no center that's going to hold. Psychoanalysis is about helping people regain the capacity to feel that they are and can be, have a right to be, the agent in their own life.
Amazing. That's really beautifully put. You also talked about Rivers and World War I and what was not called PTSD at the time, but shell shock. And we definitely wanted to ask you what your work with veterans has been like in general, and particularly bringing your psychoanalytic thinking to that work.
The funny thing is, I came here to Duke with the aim of becoming a psychoanalyst, and Duke paid more than Yale. My apologies to anybody from Yale reading this. And housing costs much less in Durham, North Carolina than New Haven, Connecticut. And they had a very good analytic institute, so I thought I'd come here. And I thought, well, I'll take this job at the VA and do it for maybe 5 years and graduate the institute and then hang out a shingle and thank the VA for their help giving me a stable income so I could do that. But even in the first months of being here, starting to talk with veterans, and my chairman, when he hired me, said, look, I want you to ride the coattails of this more accomplished fellow several years ahead of you who's taking research paradigms in depression, drug trials, family histories, neuroendocrine research. You're going to help this guy. Maybe you'll become a researcher, maybe you won't, but that's your job. And as we started doing that work, we had about 500 patients at the time. We have 10 times that many now, outpatients. He and I took every patient into our own clinic who had anything like PTSD. And we wanted to talk to as many people as possible. We developed interviews, formal interviews that became validated research protocols for PTSD. And a lot of this involved my having to ask the patient, could you tell me about the worst thing that ever happened to you? If there's something that you dream about now, something that comes back over and over, tell me about that. And I realized as I listened to them, tell me those traumatic histories, what it had done to them. This is exactly what Breuer and Freud had written about in 1895 in studies in hysteria, how traumatic events become symptoms, but that the symptom is both a representation of the trauma and a partial solution to the trauma. The two tied together, what Freud called a compromise formation, and that those two coexist but in a knot. And if the person can't keep moving forward, processing that, working it out, that they will be stuck in that compromise maybe for their whole life. Once it occurred to me that I was in a position to firsthand walk in some of the footsteps of those guys, Breuer and Freud, and that there was still a lot to discover about this, a lot we still didn't understand. I was hooked, and I stayed with the VA my entire career. And the kinds of relationships I had with those veterans, World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, Vietnam veterans, particularly the prisoners of war. I inherited 2 groups of prisoners of war. It gave me so much to think about the human experience and what people can endure and how they endure it and how the mind holds these things or fails to hold them. I've learned a great deal, and I have the honor of knowing stories that no one else is left who knows these stories.
Yeah.
And that means a great deal to me.
Yeah, that's incredible. In a general way, can you say something about what you've learned through working with those people about how the mind holds trauma and how it doesn't cope sometimes?
I think although there are thousands of individual stories, the overall arc of it is that there are things that happen to you that you can neither remember nor forget. Breuer thought it was all biological. The brain misfiled it because of the power of the experience, and it ended up in a part of the brain that it then couldn't access again unless certain reminders came along. Freud came to believe, even as he tried to do exactly what Breuer was doing, he came to a very different idea about what was happening, that they couldn't remember because they refused to remember. And why did they refuse to remember? Because they couldn't accept such a thing could happen or could happen to them. And they also couldn't accept what it meant that it happened and it happened to them. And yet, neither could they make it go away.
As I'm hearing you talk about trauma and you're holding all of these stories of trauma in your work in the Department of Defense, I'm almost hearing like the dark side of what we were talking about before with these other states of consciousness, these other ways of being. Dr. Tracy introduced you. You're doing work with the American Psychiatric Association's psychedelics committee. How do you see these, we don't even know what to call them, molecules, medicines, substances, treatments? How do you see them in the work that you're doing?
There's a simple level of let's put it to the test the way we'd put any new medicine, any mechanical or medical device, any therapy to the test. Do what we say, what we hope it will do. Does taking a psychedelic effectively take away the symptoms of PTSD? The research to date isn't strong. It still isn't strong. We look for two things. Does it work and is it safe? And I'm not saying that it isn't, but I'm saying we have not successfully demonstrated efficacy and safety. And the most research has been done with MDMA. Psilocybin coming up behind that. There's a lot of interest in ibogaine, where the safety issues become, I think, much more pressing. Cardiotoxic events, the dangers of it, but a lot of talk about it. So there's that level of it. Would you use it? So let me be very clear. If we can demonstrate efficacy, it works, and safety, then I think like any other treatment, it should be available for use. I'm even okay with the president's recent executive order saying if nothing else has worked and this can be done under professional supervision in an evidence-based way, as far as the evidence takes us, people should have access to it. I am a child of the 50s and 60s, and if I personally wanted to use one of these substances, I would be very uncomfortable with anybody telling me I couldn't. But it happens I don't want to. But I'll defend another person's right to that.
Well, related to that, in terms of the research and your feeling that there's more research that needs to be done to determine how effective and safe these medicines are. It was recently announced that next year, I think MDMA will be used not only for veterans, but for active duty military personnel. Do I understand that correctly? As far as you know, and what are your thoughts about that?
One of the problems with active duty is we really don't know what fitness for duty will be after using these drugs. We don't know enough about them, although the odds are it would be a reasonable thing to do. But the question is, if we give these substances to people, are we doing more good than harm? Are we really following science and medical ethics, or are we getting caught up in Mesmer and Charcot, and they're not the only people who kind of followed their instincts, and all the patients who clamored, said, do this for me.
Want the magic, want something amazing.
And everybody would like to be able to do that and have that. But then the question is, what is it we're doing? So what about all those other treatments that I honestly don't believe had any biological or psychological direct effect and yet help people? What was that? Well, there are many ways of healing. There are many ways in which people get better. And very often, it's the belief that this will make me better that makes you better. We talk about placebos, and placebos are nothing to laugh about. And what's the power of the placebo? It stems from a relationship, usually, between a clinician and a person, or maybe between a person and a drug. This will set me free. This will make me better. And amazingly, it often does. So let me talk about psychedelics, though, from that perspective. I believe that we have a deep cultural experience. Rivers found it in the Torres Straits Islands, but we can find it in most cultures. We can find it in religion, that we can find it in Billy Graham and in faith healing. A person with a powerful need who meets someone who offers a powerful response can become well. What do psychedelics do? Reading Aldous Huxley, The Doors of Perception, is a brilliant man with, I think, a wonderful observation on his own mescaline experience. It's beautifully written, and I have no doubt that was a profound experience which changed him in a very positive way, which I think happens for many people with psychedelics. Not all people, but many people. What did it change? I don't think it permanently rewired his brain. I think it gave him a new perspective on himself and on other people, on the world. Sort of the climax of his mescaline experience is he's looking at a chair. It's a real chair. But he has this profound sense, this chair is real. It's not just something I notice, it's real. And in itself, it has a sort of universal property in reality. Everything in reality has this powerful property, which I've trivialized up till now. And I do too. And this creates a conviction of meaning in my life, of value in my life, of something superordinate. I think LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, MDMA, ibogaine, or ayahuasca are all capable of providing that experience of something, especially when you felt you've been devalued, when you felt like my parents did lie to me, that I was lovable and worthwhile and the world was a good place and other people would be good to me and I could trust them. When Mr. Rogers said in The Disaster, when there's trouble, look for the helpers. Well, I don't believe in helpers anymore because I was in a place for which there was no help. But I think that experience is capable of restoring in a number of people that sense of, I think there is help. I think we are connected. I think I was wrong when I thought that experience ripped that all away and made me a stranger in a strange land. Now I can not only go back to the way I was, but even have a more intense sense of that. By the way, William James, who himself used a good deal of nitrous oxide, it turns out, which in his time, a return of the 20th century, was gaining popularity. And he writes in his landmark book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, that one could have an epiphany under nitrous oxide that is just as genuine as a religious epiphany. But in his book, he talks about scores of people, many of whom are very famous and well known to most people, who have a sudden experience. Sometimes it's absolutely spontaneous. It just comes upon them. Sometimes it's drug induced. Sometimes it happens in the midst of some extreme situation they're in. And they have an epiphany and they are forever changed, and usually for the good. I think there are many roads to get there. I think psychedelics are one road.
It feels to me that you are embracing, and I would like to hear more about how you do that, a real dualism, maybe even a paradox between the fidelity to science and understanding and being clear about the evidence base that something is helpful, knowing, explicit knowledge. And then on the other side, I almost want to use the word radical embracing of, you invoked William James, this mystical state as fundamentally and powerfully transformative for many people, but particularly for people who've suffered severe trauma, this loss of agency and trust that is at the core of that. And I just want to hear how you not even straddle, but just like integrate these two.
Well, if I've had an epiphany, one of them was in medical school when it was pointed out that we don't know why aspirin works. We have no idea why aspirin works, but we're not going to stop using it. But I don't know everything. I'm not going to know everything. My colleagues don't know everything. And I'm not going to wait till I know everything to do something as long as I feel, again, it's safe, that it's ethical for me to do this. And I do believe that there are many people out there, mysticism. What is mysticism? I would define it, and I keep looking it up to be sure I've got a reasonable definition. I would define it as the wish for a direct line to universal truths that without having to, like Keats, I don't have to ask questions. I don't have to know the magic words. I can just be here and commune with these truths directly in ways that are verbal and nonverbal, and I will come out of that transformed in some way. I think that for many people who are suffering from, we can call it trauma, the loss in a framework that makes it possible for us to go into the world every day and feel like I have a right to be here, that I have a right to feel safe and good about the other people around me, that this is a good world, and that if I have the least bit of luck, things will go well and good things will happen for me and those I care about. But If that all got washed away by a torrent of horrifying events that question everything about myself and everyone else, everything else, or make me feel that I have violated some universal principle which puts me again outside the bounds of the human community, maybe violated it by my direct action or by simply seeing it. It is possible, I think, that the experiences that we see at the Mithofer show with MDMA, that sense of connection to everything, that sense of feeling safe in the midst of everything, that sense that this is a ritual that I am going through, a purification, like the ones prescribed in Leviticus. If you touch a dead body, must go outside the camp and do these things. That if your house becomes infected with a fungus, which in the Bible it calls leprosy, that the house can be ill, but there is a divine answer for that. But a ritual you must perform and do it with the right authority and in the right way, that you can make this well. Whether it's the belief in the ritual, whether the drug is helping you make new connections that facilitate you stepping outside the frame of mind that you were in, I don't know, and I don't think I'm going to know in my lifetime. But if that works and if it's safe and people want it, I think that they're going to get it and should get it. I'm just still waiting. Level of medical confidence that it is.
There's a difference between not knowing how aspirin works or the room for lab error, which we would like not to be. We'd like to know how aspirin works, and that wouldn't take away from our feeling better with a headache. And we'd like to get perfect accuracy on the lab result. That would definitely be better. We accept the uncertainty. That feels different to me than what you're talking about in terms of striving for a connection to, well, a universal connection or some sense of goodness. That's a different kind of, I would call it, I don't know, I'm trying to think about this with you too. The word that I am using too is mystical, and uncertainty is a part of that, but it isn't only being uncertain. And so the question of like, how do we bring together the best of what understanding and when science is at its best brings together with this other piece, especially in bringing these, in an explicit way to help patients? How do we think about these parts?
I suspect that many people think about it many different ways. I'm quite sure that many of my colleagues think this is all biological. By the way, one thing Dr. Volkow pointed out was that if you look at some of the experiments that have been done to say, well, maybe it is just a drug. Why don't we just give the drug? Do we need what MDMA researchers in Lycos showed, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, that in fact, while you can get a very short-lived, in a matter of a week or so, positive effect just with the drug without the therapy, that if you're looking for lasting effects, the research shows it's the ones that couple it with psychotherapy that give you lasting effects. That doesn't prove which of the, was it the psychotherapy, was it the medication? It doesn't prove which, and we haven't done a good job of finding a good double-blind way of doing that.
There's so much I want to ask you about that. Before we move on, what you said about this biblical example and the leprosy and the dealing with it by going outside is very moving, actually. I think because you're talking about mysticism, there's this, why does anyone need mysticism? Why does anyone long for it? It makes me think, at least, about this violation of the moral order of what we understand to be the human moral community, that something has gone outside of that anyway, and that maybe that's part of the longing to go into the mystical and have a connection with what else is outside of the human order.
That's really the way I think about it, too. If there is something out there in the absolute, then we're wrong if we think that the world is totally corrupt and that life has abandoned us and that we could be outside of that. When in Jewish tradition, when someone dies and you get the news, you're supposed to tear a piece of clothes and then tear it in a way it can't be mended. But you're also supposed to say a very quick prayer, which is translated differently. And believe me, I'm not a great scholar of biblical, but blessed be the God of truth, or blessed be the true judge. There's two ways of translating that. And I've often wondered, well, why? Why do you say that when, especially when you've just gotten the news of something horrible, someone's died? And I think that is meant to affirm that in this world that's suddenly turned upside down with no warning whatsoever, and where I'm feeling bereaved and bereft, how can this happen? How can I lose somebody like that? How could they die? Which we know factually, well, people die, but at another level, we refuse to accept that, and we don't even know it. At some level, I don't think we even know it. We appeal that there is a God of truth, that there is a true judge, that if I don't understand this, somebody at a much higher level understands it and has made a decision that although I may not understand it, I need to live with this and this helps me live with it, because at some level, there's sense in it. I don't live in a world that makes no sense. I don't live in a world where things just happen. And I think psychedelics do a wonderful job of helping you feel that you live in a world that holds, that comes together, that things make sense. People talk about ego dissolution. If there is dissolution, it's dissolution of that complex. I was talking earlier about the compromise found where the symptom, the paralysis of my hand, my inability to see. Back during World War I, Thomas Salmon, who becomes the Army's first psychiatric consultant because he believes in we can prevent shell shock if we're proactive. All the other warring powers had a terrible problem with shell shock, but they waited for people to break down, then they tried to put them back together. And Salmon, who was already running a program here that emphasized early intervention, starting with children, kids who were kind of falling off the trajectory and running into trouble, let's get with them early. So Salmon goes to England and he watches the British try to put people back together. I'm not sure he met Rivers, but the people he did met were much more biological, who believed this was a bad brain. And quite frankly, maybe the brain was bad before they went to the war, and that's why they couldn't stand it. And he says, I don't see how this could be a brain injury, a specific brain injury, when the symptoms are so symbolically meaningful that a man who can't stand the screams of the wounded becomes deaf, and a man who can't stand the smell and the trenches of decaying bodies, of which the trenches were partly made out of decaying bodies, he loses the ability to smell. And a person who can't stand terrible sights becomes blind. This isn't a brain injury of a specific part of the brain. This is a psychological response with meaning. He wasn't an analyst, but he had read some Freud. And I think people have always been this way, and I think they're searching for new meaning. But I think that a psychedelic experience could offer, for some people, a profound sense of meaning. And it's more than an intellectual sense. It's a sense of wholeness and connection. And I think for many people, that reconnects them to the way that they were able to go through life before this terrible thing happened, whatever that terrible thing was.
I think that brings us to this topic of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Are these things connected, therapy and psychedelics? But not just therapy and psychedelics, but the medicine and the psychedelic effects. I mean, that part, especially in your work with the VA, I don't want to just read to you some of these things, but because it's very, very alive conversation, but I do want to bring some from the government's Department of Defense research agency, from their website, ideas about separating the psychedelic effects from the medicines, because I think this is, again, another attempt of navigating what is this like science and magic. In some ways, I hear you now talking about like magic also being the narrative of human experience. And if it's the stench of dead bodies in the trench, that a trauma is related to the context that a person has gone through. It's not only biomedical. It's somehow both. But that currently, so I'll read you a few quotes from the Department of Defense's research agency. on their attempts to separate the psychedelic effects. They say that psychedelic effects coupled with their unpredictable consequences render the drugs unusable in a military healthcare setting, and that specifically they're seeking a, quote, therapeutic effect that is uncoupled from deleterious neurological effects like hallucinations, but I think also the storied narrative subjective aspects. Again, just wondering if there's this, I understand that maybe on the one side there's a pull to have 2 feet firmly planted in objectivity and science, and to not need the magic, and to not need the story, and to not need the emotional aspects of trauma. But it feels like we keep coming back to, but that is what happens. That's part of the human story.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. One thing I like about being a doctor is that I'm not a scientist. I use science. But folks at DARPA are very high tech and very, very smart. And they ask a good question. Why couldn't we get a substance that doesn't have any side effects and does what we want it to do? And I wish them good luck with that. This is a human problem when you boil it all down. And it's mediated by mind and it's mediated by nerves and structures and circuits. At some level, the nerves and the structures, the circuits, and the mind are the exact same thing. And we have a lot of trouble putting our arms around that. We swing, even in psychiatry, back and forth between being very biological and being very psychological, and we hardly ever hold it all together. And I'm kind of lucky. I was interested in psychoanalysis, I guess, always, but I also came into training at a time when biological psychiatry was taking off with great promise and all sorts of possibilities. I was held responsible for trying to be good at both, and I do try. But magic falls somewhere in all of that. And I don't think a lot of my more biological colleagues are that immune to the idea of magic. They just want to have a receptor to go with it, so it can be science. I think that human beings invented magic and use magic, and back to rivers and the shamans and the Torres Strait Islands, because they need it. There's a Woody Allen joke about a man who is telling his friend, my brother thinks he's a chicken. And they say, well, why don't you bring him to a psychiatrist? He said, we would, but we need the eggs. And I think magic produces eggs for us. And we don't want to kill the goose that lays those eggs.
Do you think that the psychedelic effects, the journey effects, which are considered side effects, depending on how you look at it, or on the other hand, fundamentally important in what psychedelics do, are those the eggs?
I think that they are. As somebody whose work begins in partly with the study of dreams and takes great stake in things you say that you didn't mean to say and things you didn't mean to say that come up in other ways in your life, daydreams, I think it's all important. I think we live at the same time, consciously and unconsciously. I think that the unconscious has an advantage in that it never sleeps, and it has ways of getting into the consciousness whether we want it to or not, and it's doing it for our own good, although it doesn't always lead to good outcomes. It's trying to be honest. But I always was really impressed by a statement about French psychoanalysis. I think Lacan, who is certainly an enigmatic man, said, look, the ego is a liar. It's always trying to make peace. It's trying to make sense of things. It's trying to convince you that you're right. It's a politician. It'll do anything it can to make you believe that things are fine. You can't believe it. But the unconscious, even though it doesn't always make sense and it's filled with all these weird feelings and experiences that you don't understand, it will never lie to you. Because by its nature, it will say what it needs to say and it will want what it wants, and it won't accept any obstacle, and it doesn't mind contradictions coexisting. It will always lead you to true north.
I mean, maybe to state the obvious, it sounds like you feel that being a psychoanalyst, or at least thinking psychoanalytically, is very important in thinking about what psychedelics are doing.
I really believe that, and I think that when psychedelics, or some of them, are approved, I think psychoanalysts will have a lot to teach the people who use them. I think psychoanalysts will be a lot more helpful in understanding where that trip is taking someone, where those fantasies, those feelings, those memories that come up, those illusions that come up, where those oceanic feelings are coming up. Most psychiatrists are no longer trained to listen to people. I learned a long time ago in PTSD, I would like to say to people, it's not as bad as it seemed, you're going to be okay. The minute I say to them, if I say to them, I understand, I have lost my credibility because I will never understand. They don't understand either, and I will never understand. And to say it's going to be okay is not only naive, it is anti-therapeutic. But to be with someone as they find a new frame and to help them find their way to that frame, I do think that that's, if it's safe and we can show it works reliably, I think that that's legitimate medicine. Now, am I Anton Mesmer? Well, I hope I won't start dressing in robes with mystical symbols and carry a big metal staff to enforce my magical ability. If I'm reasonably modest about what I'm doing, if I realize, which I think is always true, that in the end the patient heals themselves, and I am skilled as a facilitator of them healing themselves, which is a psychoanalytic perspective on helping people, then I think, okay, still in the realm of being a doctor. And I have not become a guru, which I have no qualification to do, or a mystic, or I'm simply helping them do something that they haven't been able to do. If you opened up all of the treatment manuals for cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, eye movement and desensitization reprocessing, these are the three major evidence-based treatments for PTSD used here in the U.S. by the Department of Veterans Affairs, Department of Defense, and around most of the world. If you read the manual and you look at what's the mechanism of treatment, they don't know exactly, but they all say, we believe that for some reason or another, some traumatic memory continues to persist in the person's mind, which they refuse to approach because it's too painful to approach. And whether you're using prolonged exposure to force them to approach it, or using cognitive behavioral therapy to question the assumptions they made about it, which have made them stuck, or if you use EMDR, which believe really changes the activity of the brain, which brings forward the memory and makes it accessible, all three treatments work by overcoming avoidance, helping re-experience, and therefore processing the memory and making it less toxic. But I don't think that's quite complete. I think what's missing in those ideas is that it's the power of the therapeutic relationship, and it's the power of the patient's own wish, tendency, and ability to become well. What is hypnosis? It's the patient using the hypnotist as leverage, as a springboard to getting somewhere they no longer have the faith they can do for themselves. But the hypnotist offers themselves as, I can help you get there. And they say, thank God, because I need somebody's help. I don't believe I can do it. But you're telling me you're going to do it, and you're putting me through this induction. And if I can go there, I believe I can become well. I think this is a phenomenon we keep rediscovering, and then we abuse it. We expect too much of it. We mysticize it. People criticize us and criticize it. We can't do that anymore. And then we rediscover the phenomenon somewhere else. And we call it neuroplasticity.
With all of that in mind and learning from the past, what vision or hopes do you have for where the field is going, the field of psychedelics, and where psychoanalysis relates to that?
I think that we have a lot to learn from psychedelics about human nature. And I think potentially we have a powerful tool if we understand it and we use it wisely. I think there are real dangers of it not being used wisely. I think there are real dangers of us not understanding what we're doing, not for the first time, doing a lot of it, and maybe hurting people before we realize what it is we are doing. And then being again so ashamed or so censored that we will delegitimize what was good. I think maybe this time we can get it right, but it's going to take more patience than a lot of people have. And it's going to take a broader understanding of human nature, how people become ill and how they become well than are in most of our textbooks or taught in most of our schools.
Yeah, that caution is really warranted.
Caution and optimism, too. I hear that
Yes.
there. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would like nothing better than to help these people. If we can accept our limitations, but we don't give up on what we hope for, and if we're really good at what we do, we just might get there.
We might get there this time. That's a great way to end, I think. Thank you so much, Dr. Harold, for talking with us today on the Psychonaut Show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for the work you're doing.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been Dr. Tracy.
And Dr. John.
And thank you, dear Psychonauts, for joining us on this episode of The Psychonaut Show, the space where psychoanalysis and psychedelics rediscover one another.
Since we are all exploring together, you make the journey richer by subscribing to The Psychonaut Show wherever you get your podcasts, sharing with someone you think would be interested, and even leaving a rating. It helps others to find us. You can also follow us on Instagram @Psychonaut Show. And remember,
when we explore with a psychoanalytic mind and a psychedelic heart, all our worlds, imaginary, physical, personal, and social, become clearer and more connected.
until our next journey.
This podcast was edited by Resonate Recordings.